sister secretly wanted to steal my money, but when I saw it and told my parents, they said, "You're a liar, go away." I was angry and left, but when she stole the money from them. Have you ever had one of those moments where you catch someone in a lie so bold that it shakes the very foundation of how you see them? Yes, that happened to me. And it wasn't just anyone, it was my sister, Emily. Emily's always been weird, not in the quiet and quirky way that people romanticize. More like sneaky, unpredictable, always trying to manipulate people without anyone noticing. For years, she'd get away with things by acting innocent. She had a way of making our parents believe anything she said. If something was missing, Emily would blame me. If we had a fight, she'd cry and twist the story to make me look like the bad guy. Every time. It was exhausting. But lately she'd been doing something new, coming into my room when I wasn't there. I'd be in the kitchen or outside, and suddenly I'd catch her slipping out of my room like a shadow. When I'd ask her what she was doing, she'd always give me the same excuse. "Oh, I was just looking at your parrot. I have a green parrot named Kiwi. He's loud, annoying, and really not that special." Emily never cared for him before, but now she was suddenly fascinated by him. Only when I wasn't around. Yes, exactly. I wanted to believe her, but my gut told me that something was wrong. I decided to keep an eye on things. I didn't tell my parents because I knew how that would go. They'd say I was paranoid or accuse me of picking fights with her again. So I let it go until the day I caught her red-handed. I'd hidden some cash in an envelope under my bed. It wasn't much, just a few $100s I'd saved from mowing lawns and doing odd jobs over the summer. One afternoon, I went out into the backyard, but realized I'd forgotten my cell phone. When I came back inside, I heard movement from my room. Soft footsteps. I froze. The door was ajar, and through the crack I saw her. Emily was crouched by my bed, pulling out the envelope. She opened it, counted the bills, and slipped a few in her pocket like it was nothing. My heart started pounding. I pushed the door open hard enough to make her jump. "What the hell are you doing?" I demanded. She stammered something about borrowing money and paying it back. I wasn't having it. We started yelling at each other, but I didn't waste too much time arguing. I stormed off to tell our parents. Big mistake. They didn't believe me. In fact, they got mad at me for accusing them. Emily put on her usual act of tears, shook her head, and claimed I was just being mean to her. I could barely get a word in. "You're a liar, Martin. You've always been jealous of your sister." My mother said, "Enough. We're not going to put up with these false accusations anymore." My father added, "Go away, Martin. Just go cool off or something." That was it for me. I was done. I packed my things, grabbed what was left of my money, and walked out. If they wanted to believe her, fine. I wasn't going to stick around for any more of this. I went straight to my grandfather's house. I stayed at my grandfather's house for 2 weeks. It was mostly peaceful. Grandpa wasn't the kind of guy to pry or offer emotional support. He had this old school, no-nonsense vibe, but that's exactly what I needed. He didn't lecture me or try to defend Emily. He just listened and nodded like he'd seen it all before. "Sounds like she's being selfish," he finally said after I told him everything. "Reminds me of your grandmother." That threw me for a loop. I didn't know much about my grandmother. My parents always portrayed her as this saint who kept the family together. But according to Grandpa, she wasn't so angelic. She had a bad habit of spending money they didn't have, lying to cover her tracks, and charming her way out of trouble. The parallels were disturbing. The days passed slowly, but I didn't mind. I helped Grandpa with chores and distracted myself from the drama at home. It was like hitting the reset button on my life. I didn't expect to hear from my parents anytime soon. After all, they had made it clear that I was the problem. But one night, just as we were finishing dinner, the phone rang. Grandpa answered it, but his expression hardened almost immediately. He held the phone out to me. "It's your mom. Sounds urgent." I hesitated for a second before answering. "Martin," my mom's voice cracked on the other end. "Emily's gone. She stole from us. Money, jewelry, everything she could grab. We think she ran away." I was speechless for a moment. I could feel this strange mixture of justification and disbelief bubbling up inside of me. After all the times they'd called me a liar, now they were dealing with the fallout themselves. I wanted to throw their words back at them. "Go away, Martin. You're just jealous of your sister." But I held my tongue. "Did you call the police?" I asked, keeping it short. "Yes. They're trying to track her down, but we don't have much to go on. We think she might be with her boyfriend, Greg." She explained. "Greg?" That was news to me. I didn't even know that Emily had a boyfriend. But I wasn't really surprised. Emily was good at keeping secrets. "Do you want me to come back?" I asked flatly, already knowing the answer. "If you could just help us, maybe give us a chance to fix this. I'll stay here." I cut her off. "I'll let you know if I hear anything." Grandpa chuckled after I hung up. "So you're the hero now?" "Huh?" He shook his head. "Typical. People like you always push too far. Now it comes back to bite them in the ass." I thought that was the end of it. I figured Emily had just taken the money to finance whatever nonsense she was up to. Maybe she'd show up in a few days, broke and apologetic. But things weren't that simple. Not by a long shot. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Grandpa arguing with someone on the phone. He looked angry, which was rare. After he hung up, he turned to me and said, "That was your dad. The police found Greg." "Guess where?" "Where?" I asked, already preparing myself for something ridiculous. "County jail. He was arrested for possession. No sign of Emily, though." Now things were getting weird. Emily wasn't the type to hang out with people who got into serious trouble like that, or so I thought. Grandpa didn't seem surprised. "I bet she owes someone money," he said, lighting a cigarette. "Gambling, maybe?" The idea stuck with me. I began to put things together in my head. Emily had always been impulsive, but what if she was in deeper than anyone realized? Later that day, Mom called again with more news. Emily had run up thousands of dollars in debt at a casino. Apparently, she'd been sneaking out at night and gambling away everything she could get her hands on. And that wasn't the worst of it. Someone had seen her leave the casino with a man who wasn't Greg. A man with loan shark connections. After my mom told me about the casino and the guy with the loan shark connections, I started to feel uneasy. This wasn't just a case of Emily stealing for a quick buck. If loan sharks were involved, things could get dangerous. I could tell my parents were panicking, but they weren't willing to admit how deep the problem was. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept picturing worst-case scenarios: Emily hurt, hiding, or worse. I didn't like her very much, but she was still my sister. Around midnight, Grandpa came into the living room and threw me a beer. "You look like you've got a lot on your mind," he said. I nodded. "Emily's in real trouble, isn't she?" "Probably," he replied bluntly. "But sometimes people have to hit rock bottom before they figure things out." I wasn't sure I agreed. Hitting rock bottom with loan sharks could mean something far worse than a life lesson. I needed to do something, but I didn't know where to start. The next morning, things got even weirder. Grandpa's neighbor, Mrs. Finley, came over with some gossip that made my jaw drop. "Did you hear about the break-in at the pawn shop on Maple Street?" she asked, sipping her coffee. "They're saying it might have been that girl who was in the paper, Emily, right?" "Wait, Emily?" I hadn't heard anything about a break-in, let alone her name in the news. "What are you talking about?" I asked, trying not to sound too eager. Mrs. Finley leaned in like she was sharing a state secret. "Someone broke into J and J Pawn last night. The place was trashed. They said a girl matching your sister's description was caught on camera sneaking around before the alarm went off. The police are already looking for her." I stared at her in disbelief. Emily wasn't exactly criminal mastermind material. Breaking into a pawn shop didn't sound like her at all. Something didn't add up. After Mrs. Finley left, I called my mother. "Did you know that Emily's name is associated with a pawn shop robbery?" I asked right away. There was silence on the other end. "We heard about it," she finally admitted. "We don't think it's true. The police said the footage was blurry and there's no proof it's her. But we're worried, Martin. She's getting mixed up with the wrong people. Blurry footage. Suspicion without proof." I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more going on than we realized. What if someone was using Emily as a scapegoat? Or worse, what if someone had dragged her into this mess to settle a debt? Grandpa wasn't too convinced by the story either. "Sounds like someone's setting her up," he said. "Or she's in way over her head. Either way, you might want to find out before the cops do." That afternoon, I did something I never thought I'd do. I called Greg. Yes, the guy who had just been arrested. My parents gave me his contact information after the police questioned him. I wasn't expecting much, but to my surprise, he actually answered. His voice was raspy, like he'd been through hell. "Greg," I said, "I need to know what's going on with Emily. The cops are looking for her, and I'm trying to help before things get worse." There was a long pause. Then he sighed. "She's in deep, man. Real deep. She owes some money to some bad people. They've been using her to run errands." "Errands?" I repeated, my stomach churning. "Yeah, like moving stolen stuff, setting up distractions." She didn't want to do it, but when you owe people like that, you don't have a choice. I clenched my jaw. Emily wasn't just running from the law. She was involved in something far more dangerous than I'd thought. "Where is she now?" I pressed. Greg hesitated. "Last I heard, she was holed up in some motel on the east side. If you go looking for her, be careful. These guys don't mess around." Emily was now officially on the run from both police and criminals. And if I was going to find her, I had to do it fast before someone else did. After I got off the phone with Greg, I knew I couldn't just sit around. If Emily was hiding out in a motel, she wasn't safe, not from the cops, and certainly not from the people she owed money to. I grabbed my keys and told Grandpa where I was going. He didn't try to stop me, but he did give me some advice. "Be prepared for anything, Martin. If she's in deep, this could go south real fast." I drove to the east side of town, past rundown buildings and sketchy-looking convenience stores. The motel Greg had mentioned came into view, a shabby, two-story dump with flickering neon lights that read Black NCY. It wasn't the kind of place you'd stay unless you had nowhere else to go. I parked a few blocks away and approached quietly, keeping an eye out for anyone suspicious. Inside, the receptionist looked half asleep and barely glanced at me as I walked in. I played it cool and asked if a girl matching Emily's description had checked in recently. He squinted at me, then shook his head. "I don't know. We don't ask too many questions here," he said. "But try room 12. I've seen a girl come and go from there the last few nights. Could be the one you're looking for." I thanked him and made my way to room 12. My heart was pounding as I gently knocked on the door. No answer. I tapped again, harder this time. Finally, the door opened just enough for me to see a pair of wide, bloodshot eyes. Emily. Martin, she whispered, looking around nervously. Yeah, it's me. Let me in. We need to talk. She hesitated, but finally opened the door. The room was a mess: clothes, fast food wrappers, and an empty bottle of cheap vodka on the nightstand. She looked rough, like she hadn't slept in days. What the hell are you doing here? She asked, her voice tense. You shouldn't be here. Are you kidding me? Emily, everyone's looking for you. The cops, mom and dad, and from what I hear, some dangerous people. What's going on? She sank onto the bed and rubbed her temples. I didn't mean for it to get this bad. I thought I could fix everything, but I just kept digging myself in deeper. Fix what? The gambling debts? I asked. She nodded. I got hooked. It started small, just a few hundred here and there. But I lost big one night, and that's when things started to spiral out of control. I borrowed money from the wrong people. They said if I didn't pay them back, they'd come after me and the family. I sat down next to her, trying to make sense of it all. Emily, you have to turn yourself in. The police will at least protect you from these guys. She shook her head violently. You don't get it. If I go to the cops, those loan sharks will think I ratted them out. They'll come after you, Mom, Dad, all of them. I can't risk that. Before I could answer, there was a loud knock at the door. Emily's face went pale. Who is it? She whispered, her voice shaking. The knock came again, harder this time. Open up. Emily, we know you're in there. I shot her a look. You know her? She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. It's them. Emily froze, her eyes fixed on the door. I stood up and motioned for her to be quiet. My mind was racing, but I knew we couldn't let whoever was out there force their way in. I grabbed a chair and wedged it under the doorknob to buy us some time. Emily, the voice outside, growled. We're not playing games. Open the door or we'll open it ourselves. She was shaking. Martin, we have to run. Now. Running won't solve this. I whispered back. They'll just keep coming after you. We need help. I pulled out my phone and texted Grandpa. Trouble. Motel. Call police. Room 12. Grandpa wasn't the type to panic, and I knew he'd act quickly. The pounding on the door grew louder. I looked around the room, looking for something to defend myself with. There wasn't much, just a broken lamp and rusty metal hanger. Not exactly ideal. Stay behind me, I told Emily. Whatever happens, just stay calm. But before things could escalate any further, we heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The pounding stopped abruptly. The men outside cursed under their breath. Then footsteps echoed down the hall as they ran away. Emily exhaled sharply, as if she'd been her breath all along. A few minutes later, the police arrived. They questioned us about what had happened and took descriptions of the men who had threatened us. One officer assured us that they would increase patrols in the area and keep an eye out for the suspects. As things calmed down, I saw headlights pulling into the motel parking lot. It was my parents' car. They got out and ran toward us. My mom hugged Emily tightly, tears streaming down her face. My dad looked at me with a mixture of guilt and gratitude. We're sorry, Martin, he said softly. We should have believed you from the beginning. We didn't realize how bad things had gotten. Emily broke down, sobbing as she confessed everything: how she'd stolen the money, how deep her gambling debts were, and how scared she was of the loan sharks. My parents listened without interrupting, and for once, They didn't try to sweep things under the rug or blame me. "We're going to fix this," my dad said firmly. "Emily, you're going to get help. We'll pay off what we can and work with the police to make sure those guys can't hurt you or anyone else." Emily nodded weakly. It was the first time in a long time that I had seen her look vulnerable, like she was finally ready to take responsibility. Grandpa appeared a little later, shaking his head, but giving me a rare, approving smile. "You handled yourself well, kid," he said. "Looks like the family's finally pulling together." Over the next few weeks, things slowly began to improve. The police tracked down the loan sharks and arrested them on extortion and other charges. My parents paid off some of Emily's debts and set strict conditions for her to enter a gambling rehab program. For the first time in years, Emily and I actually started talking like real siblings. She apologized for everything stealing from me, lying, and turning our parents against me. As for me, I stayed with Grandpa for a while to clear my head. I needed time to trust them again, but I knew we were moving in the right direction. It wasn't perfect, but it felt like we were finally breaking free from all the lies and tension that had built up over the years. Emily still has a long way to go, but for the first time, I think she's going to be okay. And as for me, well, I've learned that sometimes family is messy, but when push comes to shove, they can still show up when it matters most. The next few weeks were surreal. It felt like I'd been living in a storm for years, and now the skies were finally clearing. Emily stayed home under my parents' supervision while she went to rehab for her gambling addiction. She also met with a counselor to deal with some of her deeper issues, the lying, manipulation, and need for control that had hurt everyone around her. I wasn't sure I could trust her yet, but at least she was trying. Meanwhile, the police were keeping us up to date on the loan sharks. They caught 3 of the guys involved in Emily's debt and threats. One of them even had evidence linking him to several other illegal activities, including drug trafficking and stolen goods. It turned out that the pawn shop break-in had nothing to do with Emily. Someone else had set it up, but the blurry footage just happened to match her description. It was a case of bad timing and bad luck. Once that was cleared up, the heat from the police finally died down. Emily also took steps to make amends with me. One night, she came to Grandpa's house while I was still there. She brought the money she had stolen from me, plus a little extra she had earned by selling some of her old things. "I know this doesn't fix everything," she said, handing me the envelope. "But I'm sorry, Martin. I'm sorry for everything, for making you out to be the bad guy all these years. I didn't realize how much damage I was doing." I looked at her for a long time. Part of me wanted to hold on to the grudge, to remind her how much hell she'd put me through. But another part of me saw that she was really trying. Maybe people really can change when they hit rock bottom. "We're not there yet," I told her, "but this is a good start." After that, we sat and talked for a while. For once, there was no tension, no games. Just 2 siblings finally trying to understand each other. It wasn't easy, but it was real. As for my parents, they also had a lot of apologizing to do. My mother, in particular, struggled with the fact that they had been so blind to what was going on. We thought we were protecting her. She said over dinner one night, her voice heavy with regret, "But all we did was enable them. I'm sorry, Martin. We failed you." "I get it," I said. "You wanted to believe the best of her. But next time, don't be so quick to dismiss me, okay?" They promised to be better, and I could tell they meant it. In the months that followed, things slowly began to normalize. Emily finished her rehab program and got a part-time job at a local bookstore. She cut ties with all of her toxic friends and even began volunteering at a support group for people with gambling problems. The police cleared her name of any criminal charges because they had evidence that she had been coerced into helping the loan sharks. Eventually, I moved back home, though I still spent a lot of time at Grandpa's house. He and I had grown closer through all of this. He was the first person to have my back when things went wrong, and I wouldn't forget that. Looks like your family finally got their act together, he said one afternoon as we sat on his porch. Took them long enough. Yeah, I chuckled, but at least they got there in the end. Emily and I were never super close again, but things were good. We respected each other now. She knew I wouldn't put up with any of her old tricks, and I knew she was working hard to change. Trust doesn't come back overnight, but little by little we rebuilt it. By the end of that year, life felt normal again. And after everything that had happened, normal was a damn good feeling. So yeah, that's how the whole mess ended up. Looking back, it's kind of crazy how much had to fall apart before we could finally put things back together. But sometimes that's the way it works. Families can break, but they can also heal if you give them a chance.